Okay, so today we'll be talking about airborne ethane observations only in the Barnett Shale. We won't have time to discuss the Bakken, but if you're interested in that topic, I'd be happy to follow up with you on that after, because we do have some interesting preliminary data from there. And so this work was done as a collaboration between University of Michigan and NOAA, and it was part of the larger Barnett Coordinated Campaign, which was funded by the Environmental Defense Fund. Oh, there we go. Right, so as we all know now, methane emissions are highly uncertain, and they're also changing currently with a contribution from the changing energy sector and changing fossil fuel extraction methods. And the changes in methane emissions from these changes in the energy sector are not well understood. And another complicating factor with respect to methane emissions is that methane emission sources are often complex. The regions are often complex with lots of thermogenic and non-thermogenic or microbial sources all mixed together. So it makes partitioning among these sources a challenge. And so a key limiting factor for understanding methane emissions is attribution. And ethane is a key species for methane attribution. And as we heard from Scott Herndon earlier, we now have a really nice way of measuring ethane, the recently developed ethane 1-second laser absorption spectrometer from Aerodyne. And the key point about ethane is that fossil fuel sources emit ethane, whereas microbial sources of methane do not. And so we can use that as an indicator of methane source. And so the way in which we've been using ethane as a tool for methane attribution consists of kind of a three-point strategy. First, we collect some of the first airborne high-resolution ethane data over emissions regions. And then we use a dual flight strategy where we characterize an emissions region by flying directly over the source region. And we couple that with downwind mass balance flights to quantify total methane and ethane fluxes from those regions. Okay, so the first observations from the Barnett Shale are plotted here, and these are flight tracks over a region of dense oil and gas production, colored by either ethane or methane, and they're overlaid on primarily gas-producing wells in gray or primarily liquid-producing wells in black. And sort of for clarity, those are the only sources I've put on these plots, but it's worth noting that there are many other emission sources as well, other fossil fuel-related sources such as gas processing plants and landfills, which is something that makes this next plot so exciting and interesting. Despite this complex source region, when we do a tracer-tracer plot of the ethane to methane over the entire region, what we see are these three emergent correlation, or these three emergent ethane to methane ratios that describe this region. We've got kind of a high ethane source, a low ethane source, and then our ethane-free microbial source. And again, this is surprising because of the complex emissions that are in this region, and it's also exciting because we can use these correlations for attribution. And so if we study and look at all of the observed slopes or all of the observed ethane to methane relationships over this source region, we construct a histogram of the frequency of observed slopes. And again, we see these three prominent correlations of 0% ethane to methane, 2%, and 10% emerge from the histogram, although obviously there's some other ratios mixed in there as well. Now we're getting a sense of the fractional contribution of different sources to the total methane emissions. And so, using this histogram, we've developed three methods to estimate the fossil fuel contribution to emissions, to methane emissions in the Barnett region. And we won't have time to go through all three of them, but I'll just briefly describe them for you here. The first method is based on the histogram, and we divide it into kind of two distributions, one centered around the 0% peak and attribute that to a microbial source, and everything else to fossil fuels. The second is based on assessing the significance of the ethane to methane correlation over the field, using the p-value of that correlation, and uncorrelated ethane to methane data is assigned as microbial. And then the third method is based on looking at the total ethane flux to methane flux in the region, and assuming that that ratio arises from a linear combination of these three prominent correlations that we see over the source region. So just to quickly describe the first method, you can see the peak there at 0%. We assume that's all due to microbial activity, and that minimum between the first two peaks translates to an inflection point in the cumulative distribution function of that histogram. And so we assign everything to the left of that point, methane from a microbial source, and everything to the right, methane from a fossil fuel source. And the result of that analysis gives us about 15% microbial source of methane. And so just to summarize the results of these three methods, we end up getting about 20% methane emissions from microbial source in the Barnett region, and about 80% methane emissions from fossil sources. And the results of our third analysis, which we could go into detail after if you're interested, actually provides a nicely tight constraint on the high ethane fossil fuel source of methane, attributing about 45% to a high ethane fossil fuel source. So we can combine all of these and give a breakdown of 45% high ethane fossil fuel, 35% low ethane fossil fuel, and 20% microbial as the source breakdown for the Barnett region. So implicit in all three of those analyses is the assumption that this flight over the source region that we use to construct the histogram and that we use to construct the tracer-tracer plot showing the nice three correlations. We assume that that flight over the source region is representative of all of the emission sources. And so in order to test whether or not we kind of got a nice sample of all of the emissions that are representative of what the integrated downwind emissions, we construct a simple model where we advect the source observations downwind. And along the right there shows the simulated line versus the actual observed downwind ethane, methane, and ethane to methane ratio emissions. And they match, so that's good. So that means that our one flight over the source region was a representative sample of all of the emission sources. Okay, and so again, when we did our downwind measurements, we also were able to get tightly constrained ethane fluxes from the Barnett Shale region for the first time. And again, this is a surprising result. We got very consistent emissions day to day. Which is a surprise because we measured over 6 days, which means 6 wind directions and 6 wind speeds, and over 2 seasons in March and October of 2013, and over a complex source region. And we ended up, if you're interested in the number, with 6.6 times 10 to the third kilogram per hour flux of ethane from the region with a range of 6.3 to 6.8. And then one final warning and one final point about this data is that one of the new things that we're doing here is using the 1-second ethane data from the Aerodyne instrument. And so there's a caution, a traditional or a typical way of doing correlations for attribution is to use discrete samples. And so we just want to show here that if you use the discrete sample, which is the plot of the red points on the right, if you subsample the ethane data set, you can produce different ethane to methane relationships that are not representative of any of the underlying ethane to methane relationships, which could change the attribution. And so it's just kind of a caution there. Okay, and so to conclude, we've demonstrated a new method using airborne 1-second ethane measurements, using flights to characterize source emissions, and flights to characterize downwind mass balance flux emissions. And combining all of these, we've developed multiple new techniques to be able to partition the methane emissions. The results of these analyses for the Barnett Shale attribute about 80% of methane emissions to fossil fuel sources and about 20% of methane emissions to microbial or non-thermogenic sources. We also measured the first ethane fluxes from the Barnett Shale, and they're consistent over multiple days, wind directions, and seasons, which supports the validity of the new technique and shows that our emissions are consistent. And the last point is that we have applied these methods to the Barnett Shale, but we have also are working on applying them to the Bakken Shale in North Dakota, and we're also planning to head out to the San Juan Basin, New Mexico, and Marcellus, PA. And so these methods are extendable to other emissions regions. With that, I'd like to take some questions.
Are there any questions?
They're concentrations. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah.
I have a quick question. Could you expand a little bit more on the reason why subsampling gives you slopes that are not consistent with what you've seen? It seems like a subsample would be more isolating specific plumes, but if that's causing problems, then I'm curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, so I suppose it would depend on like your sampling strategy for subsampling. So if you're targeting specific plumes, you might get a different result. What this example is showing is we did take discrete flash samples on these flights, and so if you had only used ethane data from those flash samples, and they did target different regions, some were in like the troposphere, some were in the boundary layer, and some targeted different plumes. So depending on how you filter that data, you might be able to do a better job. But yeah, the point is that you might miss the fine structure or some of the details by only doing discrete samples. So the most that we did with that was sort of look at whether they were associated with liquid-producing wells or primarily gas-producing wells. And you do see peaks in the ethane to methane ratio in those regions where the liquid production is most dense. And that's kind of as far as we went with ascribing it to specific source types. Yeah, and there clearly are some other sources in there. So this is there's some assumptions that go into this analysis. Yeah.